The water sizzled with the sound of laughter. Not mine, not anyone I'd invited. I stood frozen at the edge of my own backyard, blinking at the surreal sight of wine glasses clinking, bikini straps snapping, and Karen, yes, HOA Karen, lounging in my brand new hot tub like it was her personal throne. A man I'd never seen before was pouring champagne into her glass while his purple swim trunks hung dangerously low. She looked over, raised her glass toward me without an ounce of shame, and said, "Oh good, you're back. We were just saying how lucky the neighborhood is to have a communal amenity like this." My hands clenched. I hadn't even used it yet. That hot tub? That was my birthday gift to myself. But now it was bubbling with strangers, spilled margarita, and Karen's lavender foot drifting right over the temperature sensor. That was the exact moment I decided something. This woman needed a lesson. And I had just the scientific prank in mind. 3 weeks earlier, I was living in perfect suburban peace. I'd moved to Woodpine Ridge for its quiet charm and low crime rate, not the micromanaging terror that came with Karen's HOA presidency. My name's Sam, by the way. Software developer, introvert, master of passive revenge, and apparently the last man on Earth who thought privacy still meant something. I'd spent the better part of 2 months researching, customizing, and installing my dream hot tub. Heated jet streams, LED mood lighting, even a Bluetooth speaker system that could cue up smooth jazz before my foot hit the first step. The whole setup was tucked neatly behind privacy fencing, within the property lines I'd paid extra to have surveyed just to avoid HOA nonsense. And for a brief moment I genuinely believed I'd created my own sanctuary. That illusion shattered the day Karen came around for what she called a routine inspection. She was wearing a visor, carrying a clipboard, and chewing gum like it personally offended her. She paused at my fence, peered through a crack, and let out a disapproving hum. "Lovely addition," she said in that voice people use when they want to sound polite but actually mean the opposite. Of course, technically, outdoor installations like this should be subject to HOA review. But I'll let it slide this time. I reminded her, very calmly, that the HOA had no jurisdiction over private amenities installed behind the fence, which she knew. She gave me a weird little smile and scribbled something on her clipboard. That was the first red flag. The second came when she casually mentioned how communal spirit was important and how neighbors should be able to share resources. 2 days later, I came home to find footprints in the wet concrete near my hot tub. Not from construction, fresh ones. I checked my backyard camera only to discover a couple from down the street climbing over my locked gate in broad daylight, robes flapping in the wind like suburban ninjas. I called Karen immediately. She answered, naturally, like she was the Queen of England fielding peasant complaints. "Oh yes, that was me," she said with zero remorse. "I told Cheryl and Doug they could try it out. I thought you wouldn't mind. Sharing builds community." "No, Karen," I said, already regretting every life choice that led me to this neighborhood. "That is trespassing." She had the gall to laugh. "Oh relax. It's just water." It wasn't just water. It was my peace, my investment, my retreat from the madness of work, people, noise, and, ironically, Karen herself. So I changed the lock, updated the security system, and put up a very polite but very direct sign that read, "Private property. Trespassers will be reported." I thought that would be the end of it. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Which brings us to the day of the invasion. I just returned from a quick weekend trip, one I hadn't advertised to anyone but apparently hadn't needed to. Karen had noticed my car missing and decided that was free invitation. When I rounded the corner into my backyard and saw a full-blown pool party in progress, I didn't even react at first. My brain stalled, trying to process what I was seeing. Balloons. A mini speaker playing 90s dance hit. A folding table with snacks. Someone had even strung up fairy lights. My backyard looked like it had been hijacked by Pinterest. Karen spotted me before I could speak and did that thing where she acts like she's doing me a favor. She waved, completely unbothered by the fact that she and her guests were not only in my yard but actively soaking in my hot tub like they'd paid for the privilege. Her voice rang out over the music like a clanging bell of entitlement. "Hope you don't mind, Sam. The board agreed this should be community space. We even brought our own cups." I didn't answer. I just turned around, walked back into my house, and quietly closed the door. My hands were shaking, but not with fear. With excitement. See, I'd always had a little mischievous streak. And I also happened to have a good friend from college named Devin, currently working in an industrial dye lab testing water-reactive compounds. Just last month, he'd told me about a formula they use to trace heating systems in large-scale buildings. Completely safe. Totally invisible. And when heated, it turned a lovely, vibrant, unforgiving shade of purple. I dialed his number. "Hey Devin," I said, barely containing the grin spreading across my face. "Hypothetically, how fast can you ship me something fun? And maybe a little purple?" By the time Devin's package arrived, I had already spent 2 full days planning every detail of the operation. This wasn't just about petty revenge anymore. This was justice, a hot, bubbling, dye-stained reckoning for every passive-aggressive email, every unsolicited newsletter, and every unwanted community bonding event Karen had ever imposed on the neighborhood. The box arrived in the most unassuming brown packaging, but inside was a small container of magic. Devin had labeled it with a sticky note that read, "For educational purposes only, totally legal, mostly funny." The dye was odorless, colorless at room temperature, and completely undetectable when dissolved in water. But once the temperature crossed 98 degrees Fahrenheit, the exact temperature my hot tub liked to maintain, it would activate into a blinding shade of deep royal purple. And once it set into skin? Well, let's just say it made a statement. I spent that night testing it like a mad scientist. I filled a bucket with water and watched it sit, looking clear as ever. Then I added heat. Slowly, carefully, I poured in boiling water until the temperature nudged over the threshold. Within seconds, the clear water began to swirl with the unmistakable hue of cartoon villain energy. It was beautiful. Like grape juice on steroids. I dipped an old sock into the bucket and watched it transform like it had just graduated from clown school. Even after a full rinse, the sock stayed purple. I was impressed. Devin had outdone himself. The next morning, I got to work installing it into the tub's circulation system. My setup allowed for additive pods, meant for spa fragrances and minerals, but conveniently perfect for my new secret weapon. I mixed the compound into one of the unused pods and slid it into place. All that remained was the test run. I heated the water, waited a few minutes, and dipped in a gloved finger. When I pulled it out, the glove had bloomed into violet glory. It was perfect. My only regret was not having popcorn ready for what was coming. Of course, a prank this satisfying required bait. And to lure Karen back in, I had to be subtle. I parked my car around the block. I posted a long weekend getaway photo on social media with a suspiciously generic palm tree background. I even left a package on my front porch labeled Vacation Sunscreen. Karen wasn't smart, but she was nosy, and that made her predictable. It didn't take long. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, I sat in my upstairs room with my laptop, monitoring the security cameras like I was running a heist. At exactly 3:47 p.m., the gate creaked open. Karen strutted in like she owned the place, holding a Bluetooth speaker under one arm and a bottle of sparkling cider under the other. Trailing behind her were 6 more of the HOA's most loyal sycophants, including Cheryl, Doug, and a man who I swear only appeared at events where free snacks were present. They were all in swimwear. They even brought pool noodles. Pool noodles. Into someone else's private yard. Karen snapped her fingers and ordered Doug to start the bubbles. Within seconds, my hot tub was roaring. She dipped her toe in first, then sank into the water with the kind of moan usually reserved for luxury spas and melodramatic movies. One by one, the others followed. For the first 5 minutes, it was just laughter, splashing, and clinking plastic cup. I leaned in toward the screen. I was practically holding my breath. Then came the moment. At first, no one noticed. Karen was busy bragging about some new HOA beautification initiative, and Cheryl was already 2 drinks deep. But then one of the younger guests, Jason, I think, looked down at his arm and blinked. Is this normal? He held up his forearm. It was turning purple. Not like a bruise, not like a sunburn, purple. Grape popsicle purple. Cheryl looked at her own legs and screamed. Why am I purple? Oh my God, is this dye? Karen sat up, confused, then horrified as she noticed her stomach and thighs glowing like royalty. What the hell is this? The party unraveled in seconds. People scrambled out of the tub, slipping on the wet deck, tripping over each other, yelling about allergies and lawsuits and chemical burns. One guy ran straight into a lawn chair and knocked himself backward. Karen, now standing in all her regal violet glory, pointed at the tub like it had betrayed her. This is sabotage, she shrieked, dripping purple water onto the concrete. He did this. That little tech gremlin next door. I muted the audio and leaned back, smiling so hard my cheeks hurt. They flailed around my yard like confused flamingos, yelling into their phones, holding up stained towels, and inspecting each other for signs of spreading. It was chaos. It was art. And best of all, it was all on camera. After the screaming died down and the purple parade finally shuffled out through the gate, still arguing about who touched what, I backed up the footage to the cloud. Just in case. I didn't hear from Karen directly that night. But the neighborhood group chat was lit. Memes started flying almost immediately. Someone photoshopped Karen's face onto Grimace from McDonald's. Another resident wrote a fake poem titled, The Lavender Menace. I didn't post anything. I didn't have to. By Sunday morning, the gossip had made it to the neighboring development. People I hadn't spoken to in months were texting me with questions. One guy asked if I was planning to bottle the dye and sell it as a public deterrent. Another offered to buy me dinner just to hear the full story. Still, I knew Karen wasn't the type to take humiliation lying down. Sure enough, Monday brought the retaliation. She filed a formal HOA complaint against me for chemical warfare and creating a hostile environment. She demanded an emergency board meeting to discuss disciplinary action. I wasn't worried. I had evidence. I had receipts. And most importantly, I had the moral high ground. She showed up to the meeting in a turtleneck and jeans, still faintly lavender in places where the dye had clung to her skin. Her face, despite obvious scrubbing, had a rosy purple tint like she'd lost a fight with a beet. The board was clearly skeptical as she launched into her tirade about me being a neighborhood menace. But before she could finish, I calmly stood and passed out copies of the property survey, my permit paperwork, and, just for flavor, a flash drive containing the full surveillance footage. No narration. No edits. Just raw, uncut, purple chaos. Karen went silent. The board stared. And someone, I swear, let out a quiet chuckle. That's when I knew. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But the tide had turned. I'd turned her party into a punchline. And now I was just getting warmed up. The sun rose on a neighborhood still buzzing from the aftermath of the Great Purple Incident. For the first time since I'd moved into Woodpine Ridge, the group chats weren't full of complaints about lawn height or garbage bins left out too long. They were alive with memes, puns, and jokes that sent Karen spiraling into a damage control frenzy. I woke up to screenshots of her trying to delete comments on the HOA forum, but by then it was too late. The internet had already embraced her new nickname, Purple Rain. Someone even edited a photo of her standing in my yard, soaked and screaming, and added glowing eyes and lightning bolts behind her. I saved that one for personal reasons. It was art. I stayed quiet. No gloating, no smug replies. The golden rule of suburban warfare is simple. When your enemy is imploding, just sit back and let them dig. And Karen? She wasn't just digging. She was practically operating heavy machinery at this point. The emergency HOA meeting she called was supposed to be her big comeback, a dramatic condemnation of my so-called misconduct. Instead, it backfired spectacularly. After I presented my property documentation and the footage, the board members exchanged nervous glances. Even Cheryl, her most loyal sidekick, looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. One board member, a guy named Rick who never said much, cleared his throat and asked, "Wait, you were trespassing?" Karen stammered something about community trust and unspoken agreements, but it was clear no one was buying it. The vote to dismiss her complaint wasn't even close. I didn't celebrate. I just packed up my flash drive and walked out of the meeting with a calm, satisfied smile, like a man who knew this was only the beginning. The real fallout hit the next morning. Karen doubled down with a public Facebook post on the neighborhood page titled, "Toxicity in Our Community, a Warning." It read like a poorly written villain monologue. She accused me of using hazardous chemicals, trying to poison community morale, and being a technologically manipulative individual with a history of anti-HOA behavior. Naturally, the comments tore her apart. Neighbors demanded proof. Others asked why she was in my hot tub at all. My favorite comment was from an older resident named Edith, who simply wrote, "So we just walk into each other's homes now? I call dibs on your fridge, Karen." That one got over 200 likes in less than an hour. But Karen wasn't done. She filed a complaint with the county's residential health department, claiming I had installed a biological hazard in a residential area. I only found out when a health inspector showed up at my door on Wednesday afternoon holding a clipboard and looking thoroughly confused. "You Sam?" he asked, flipping through a folder. "Last time I checked. I've got a complaint about improper chemical use in a residential water feature," he said. "Mind if I take a look at your hot tub?" I didn't even blink. "Of course," I said, stepping aside. "Would you like some lemonade while you inspect my lavender crime scene?" He chuckled. At least he had a sense of humor. The inspection took 20 minutes. I explained everything: how the dye was non-toxic, how it was legally purchased, how it was used as a deterrent and not as a trap. I even handed him the documentation Devon had included, complete with chemical safety data. The inspector nodded, jotted down some notes, and then, almost as an afterthought, said, "You know, the funny thing is we actually had a complaint about this same HOA a few months back. Something about unauthorized food services at community event. Think that's related?" I raised an eyebrow. "Maybe. Karen does love her shrimp platters." He gave me a grin that said more than words ever could. "Thanks for the hospitality. I'll be filing this under neighborly nonsense. Don't worry, you're in the clear." As soon as he left, I realized something crucial. Karen's overreach had officially backfired. Her complaint not only failed, but it had also opened the door to investigations into her own behavior. I didn't plan that part, but I wasn't about to waste the opportunity. That night, I received an anonymous message through the neighborhood board's online portal. It was from someone on the HOA board. The message simply read, "You didn't hear it from me, but check the event fund records. Things don't add up." Attached was a file, spreadsheets, expense reports, scanned receipt. I opened it, heart pounding, and there it was in black and white. Karen had been charging event fees 4 years, logging the expenses as HOA costs, and then quietly pocketing leftover funds. Hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars. I cross-referenced the names, dates, vendors. Half of them were made up. She wasn't just annoying. She was corrupt. I didn't go to the HOA. I didn't go to the police. I went to the resident. I printed a few choice pages of the documents, just enough to raise eyebrows, and taped them anonymously to the community bulletin board outside the clubhouse. By the next morning, the papers were gone, but the whispers had begun. Within 24 hours, Karen was facing more pressure than a soda can in a microwave. People started demanding a full audit. Cheryl resigned from the board. Doug claimed he had no idea, and that he only came for the shrimp. Karen tried to defend herself, but every time she opened her mouth, someone else brought up the dye incident. Her credibility was leaking faster than her reputation. And then, just when I thought she might retreat quietly, Karen made her boldest and dumbest move yet. She announced that she was suing me for emotional distress. She filed a civil suit claiming that my chemical prank caused her psychological trauma, social ostracization, and a persistent skin tint that interfered with her professional life. She even attached photos of her still slightly purple hands. I laughed out loud at my desk, alone. Then I immediately called my lawyer. "Discovery's going to be fun," I told him. "You should see the footage." My lawyer, bless his petty soul, said, "Let's make this the HOA trial of the decade." And that's exactly what we planned to do. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was going to expose every shady corner of Karen's rule. And when it was over, she wouldn't just lose the lawsuit, she'd lose the one thing she valued most. Control. Purple might fade from skin, but scandal? Scandal sticks. The court date was still a few weeks away, but Karen wasn't wasting any time trying to salvage what remained of her crumbling empire. Flyers suddenly appeared around the neighborhood advertising a community unity picnic, hosted by none other than Karen herself. Free food, face painting, a bounce house for kids, even a raffle for a flat-screen TV. It was a blatant PR move, an obvious attempt to distract from the dye debacle and financial whispers swirling like wildfire through Woodpine Ridge. I saw her out there the morning of the event, barking orders at volunteers like a washed-up cruise director clinging to relevance. Her purple tint had faded mostly by then, but there was still a ghost of it around her wrists and neck, like a stain that refused to be scrubbed from either skin or memory. I had no intention of attending the picnic, but I knew someone who would. That someone was a friend of mine from high school named Alicia, now a full-time event inspector for the county. We'd reconnected recently over social media, and when I casually mentioned the ongoing Karen drama, she practically begged to take a look. I told her about the food, the bounce house, and the raffle. She told me that technically, if Karen was charging fees, hosting food vendors, or organizing games involving minors, there were permits required, permits she likely didn't have. And just like that, Alicia had herself a weekend outing. I watched the picnic unfold from a distance, a coffee in hand and my camera feed up on the laptop. The turnout was decent, but the vibe? Awkward at best. People were polite but cautious. Some were probably there for the raffle, others just for curiosity. A few board members stood stiffly under a tent, clearly trying not to make eye contact with Karen, who was all smiles and forced cheer. Alicia arrived around noon, blending in like just another mom with a clipboard. It didn't take her long to start noticing violations. Improper food storage. No visible hand-washing station. Bounce house too close to electrical cords. I didn't even have to say a word. By the time the cotton candy machine sputtered and the raffle table collapsed under the weight of poorly organized prizes, Alicia had seen enough. She approached Karen calmly, introduced herself, and asked for the event permit. I couldn't hear what was said, but the body language said everything. Karen's posture stiffened. Her smile vanished. Her eyes darted toward the raffle table, then to the crowd. Whatever excuse she gave didn't work. Alicia made a call, took a few pictures, and 15 minutes later, 2 more inspectors showed up. The picnic didn't get shut down entirely, but by then most guests had left anyway, either out of boredom or growing discomfort. Karen stood there holding a raffle ticket and a forced grin as her last desperate play crumbled like a stale cookie. The following Monday, a formal report landed at the HOA office. Multiple code violations. A warning. A recommendation for follow-up fines. Karen tried to spin it, of course. Claimed she was targeted, sabotaged, even hinted at a coordinated campaign against her by certain tech-savvy residents. No one bought it. The board, now down 2 members thanks to resignations, called for a financial audit of the HOA's records. That was the breaking point. The documents I had anonymously circulated earlier were now under official review. A third-party auditor was hired. I kept my head down and let it all unfold, even though I already knew what they'd find. Fake invoices, overstated expenses, checks written to vendors that didn't exist. Karen had been using HOA funds to pay for everything from her dry cleaning to her cousin's landscaping company. It was sloppy, obvious, and now public. The mood in the neighborhood shifted from mocking amusement to quiet rage. Homeowners started organizing informal meetings without her. There was talk of replacing the board entirely. A petition started circulating. I signed it under my dog's name. Karen, desperate to save face, posted a video on the HOA website declaring her innocence. In it, she sat stiffly on her porch, reading from a script blaming a small group of disruptive residents for twisting the truth. Her purple fingers, still faintly stained, fidgeted with the corner of her note card. Then, in one of the most deliciously ironic turns of all, the local news caught wind of the story. A reporter showed up asking questions about the purple dye hot tub incident, but once they started digging, they found the audit reports, the shady accounting, the failed picnic permits. Suddenly it wasn't a prank story anymore, it was a suburban scandal. They ran a segment called Trouble in Woodpine Ridge, When the HOA Goes Too Far, complete with dramatic background music and a slow zoom on Karen's front door. I watched it 3 times. Meanwhile, preparations for the lawsuit were in full swing. Karen hadn't dropped it, probably because it was her last card to play. She still believed, somehow, that she could win in court, that if she just framed it right, a judge would sympathize with her. Emotional distress, public embarrassment, humiliation. Her list of grievances was long, but empty. My lawyer, Brian, was having the time of his life. He called me one evening and said, "I hope you're ready. We're going to file a counterclaim." I was already smiling. For what? Trespassing, harassment, defamation, and punitive damages for wasting the court's time. I love the sound of that. We're also submitting the video footage as evidence, Brian continued. And your property documents. Plus, your friend Alicia submitted an affidavit regarding the unpermitted picnic. It's airtight. Karen had backed herself into a corner and slammed the door shut. And still, she had no idea how bad it was about to get. In the days leading up to the hearing, the neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath. People were polite, yes, but curious. The same folks who once avoided drama were now whispering about Karen's downfall at dog parks and driveway conversations. I caught more than one neighbor waving at me with a knowing smile. Karen, meanwhile, had vanished. Her porch was dark. Her car stayed in the garage. The only sign of life was a small, "Support our HOA," sign she stuck in her lawn, which someone eventually replaced with a purple balloon. I spent one final night reviewing everything. The footage, the emails, the text she sent Cheryl about how I was, probably too dumb to notice, their hot tub invasion. I organized everything into a neat folder and placed it in my bag, feeling calm, collected, and just a little excited. The prank had been satisfying. The chaos afterward had been entertaining. But now? Now it was time for the final blow. She thought she was dragging me into court for revenge. But I was walking in to bury her entire reign in front of a judge. And the best part? She dyed her own hands purple. The courthouse smelled like floor polish and stress. I walked in wearing my best navy suit and the kind of calm expression that said, "I didn't start this war, but I'm sure as hell going to finish it." Brian met me just inside the courtroom doors, clipboard in hand, already scanning the docket with the glee of someone who'd been waiting months for the perfect cross-examination. Karen was already seated at the plaintiff's table, dressed in an overly conservative beige pantsuit that looked like it had been picked out by someone desperate to appear harmless. Her makeup was heavy, but it couldn't mask the faint lavender hue still clinging to the sides of her neck. She didn't look at me. Not once. Not as I sat down. Not as the judge entered. Not even as the bailiff called the case. but I could feel the tension rolling off her in waves. The courtroom wasn't packed, but enough curious neighbors had shown up to fill the back rows. A few even nodded at me, silently offering their support. The scandal had become more than a neighborhood story, it was a local event. Karen's lawyer, a man who looked like he had printed his degree from an online website, started things off with a dramatic retelling of the Purple incident. He used words like ambush, chemical trauma, and emotional scarring. He described the dye as a malicious foreign agent introduced to induce humiliation. At one point, he referred to my backyard as a psychological trap. Brian leaned over and whispered, "Didn't realize you were a Bond villain." I didn't smile. I wanted to, but I didn't. I let them keep talking, digging the hole deeper. Karen took the stand and did her best to cry. It was awkward. Her voice cracked in all the wrong places, and the moment she claimed that she hadn't realized the hot tub wasn't for public use, someone in the back of the room let out a short laugh. The judge raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Then it was our turn. Brian began with the security footage, unedited, time-stamped, and clear as day. The moment Karen and her cronies climbed my fence. The moment they threw their towels over my patio chairs. The champagne. The Bluetooth speaker. The soaking. The screaming. The dye. Every glorious minute played on the screen while Karen squirmed in her seat. When it ended, the courtroom was silent. Brian stood calmly and asked the judge, "Is it trespassing if you throw a party in someone's backyard without permission?" The judge didn't answer, but his expression said plenty. Next came the property records, showing the tub was installed within my boundary lines, paid for entirely out of pocket, with full compliance to zoning and HOA rules. Then the financial audit report, recently finalized and conveniently available through public record, revealing years of Karen's misappropriations, unauthorized expenses, missing funds, falsified vendors. The judge flipped through the pages slowly, methodically, like someone reading the plot twist of a mystery novel where the villain turns out to be dumber than expected. Brian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than any argument could. Then came the real nail in the coffin, an affidavit from Alicia, the county inspector, detailing the violations from the picnic Karen held in her attempt to save face. No permits, no sanitation measures, electrical hazards, all of it documented, signed, and submitted into evidence. Karen's lawyer tried to object, claiming it was irrelevant. The judge overruled him without even looking up. When it came time for me to testify, I kept it simple. I told the truth. How I had warned Karen multiple times. How I had installed the dye purely as a harmless deterrent. How I had used a legal, non-toxic compound that had no lasting effects beyond color. I described the trespassing, the lack of remorse, the false accusations, and finally the retaliation through public defamation. Then I sat back down. Brian wrapped things up with a quiet summary that ended with, "If the plaintiff had simply respected a neighbor's property, we wouldn't be here. But instead, she chose to throw a party in someone else's hot tub and then sue them when it went viral." The judge took his time reviewing the files. When he finally looked up, his voice was flat, but final. "I find in favor of the defendant on all counts," he said, glancing toward Karen with the tired eyes of a man who had seen one too many petty feuds. "The court dismisses the plaintiff's claims of emotional distress. Furthermore, the court grants the defendant's counterclaim. The plaintiff is hereby ordered to pay damages for trespassing, legal fees, and defamation." Karen's jaw dropped. The room didn't erupt, but you could feel the shift. The wave of satisfaction, the deep, collective exhale from everyone who had watched her reign over Woodpine Ridge with her smug clipboard and synthetic smile. I didn't say anything. I didn't look her way. I just shook Brian's hand, thanked the judge, and walked out into the sunlight feeling lighter than I had in months. Word spread fast. By the time I got home, 3 neighbors had already dropped off congratulations in the form of cupcakes, coffee, and one particularly bold bottle of champagne with a tag that read, your tub, your rules. Karen didn't show her face for the next 2 weeks. Rumors swirled. Some said she was staying with her sister, others that she'd hired a crisis PR firm. The HOA held a special vote and removed her from the board by an overwhelming majority. Her nameplate was removed from the office door. Her clipboard was nowhere in sight. With Karen gone, things slowly returned to normal. Or at least a better version of normal. The new HOA president, a retired Marine named Victor with zero patience for nonsense, called me personally to apologize and promise that the board would no longer involve itself in private property matters. He even joked that maybe they should start a dye fund for future enforcement. I never used the purple dye again. The pod remained sealed in a glass container in my kitchen labeled, "Break in case of emergency." It became something of a neighborhood legend, a reminder that sometimes a well-timed prank says more than 1,000 angry emails, that boundaries matter, and that if you trespass into someone's space thinking you're untouchable, you might walk out a very different color. Months later, during a quiet evening barbecue in my now peaceful backyard, someone brought up the incident again. A new neighbor asked if it was true that Karen once turned entirely purple. I smiled, poured myself a drink, and simply said, "Only from the neck down." We laughed, we toasted, and as the sun dipped behind the trees, I looked over at the hot tub, quiet, clean, and entirely mine. Peace had returned to Woodpine Ridge. Purple peace.